The black wreath on the door of Harcombe Park had been there 3 months, and no one had thought to take it down. Nicholas Ashby, Viscount Fenwick, reined his horse at the top of the gravel drive and looked at it for a long moment before dismounting. He had returned from the continent only a fortnight ago, thinner than he had left, and quieter in ways he could not yet explain to anyone who had not been at the siege works in the autumn rain. He had heard the news of the Duchess of Harcombe's passing in a dispatch letter forwarded to him at Bilbao, a single line appended to a longer note from his man of business. The Duchess is gone. Consumption, very sudden. He had meant to call sooner, he had not been able to make himself do it. The house was still in the way of great houses closed against grief, the drawing-room shutters half drawn, the fountain in the forecourt drained for the season. The elm avenue on the east side had shed its leaves in a long copper drift across the lawn, and no one had raked them. That was the detail that snagged him, the detail that made him frown as his groom took the horse around. The Duke of Harcombe had been particular about the grounds. When Charles Harcombe was living, there was not a fallen leaf on the lawn by noon. The butler admitted him with the stiff reserve of a household in official mourning. Lady Eugenia Harcombe received him in the west drawing-room, dressed in full black bombazine with a diamond brooch at her collar that caught the thin autumn light coming through the half-shuttered windows. She was 52 years old and angular in the way of women who have always known exactly where they stand. Her silver hair dressed in a formal arrangement that suggested she had expected callers. She held her fan at a measured height, a habit Nicholas had noticed before, as though the fan were a small scepter she was choosing, at every moment, not to raise above her head. Viscount Fenwick. She extended her hand with practiced gravity. "We are touched that you have come. These months have been a great sorrow." Nicholas expressed the proper condolences. He did not stay long in the drawing-room. He could not account for the restlessness that had taken him when he crossed the threshold, some reading of the house that put him on guard without a name for the cause. He asked, as a matter of courtesy, if he might walk the grounds, as the late Duke had once walked them with him on autumn afternoons, when they were young men together at Oxford. Lady Eugenia inclined her head. The butler was instructed to accompany him. He did not require the butler, he said so pleasantly but firmly, in the voice that had successfully redirected 2 senior officers on the peninsula, and the man retreated. Nicholas went alone into the kitchen garden, through the iron gate in the south wall, and along the moss-edged path that ran behind the succession houses, to the old stone outbuildings at the garden's far end. It was there, at the far end of the path, that he heard it. A sound, not quite speech, not quite silence. A sound like the deliberate suppression of breath. He stopped. The sound had come from behind the door of the farthest garden shed, a low stone building with a rusted hasp and a padlock that was notably newer than the door around it. He stood listening for 30 seconds in the gray autumn still. Then he walked to the door and knocked. The interior of the shed was 7 feet by 9, and Dorothea had memorized every inch of it. She knew the spot on the north wall where the mortar had crumbled and could be pried loose to admit a thread of outdoor air. She knew which floorboard, the third from the door on the left side, had a gap wide enough to conceal a folded document. She knew that the high shelf on the east wall, which was occupied by clay pots and a broken diver and a length of jute twine, would just bear her weight if she wished to look through the single small vent near the roofline at the quality of the morning sky. She had not been able to see actual sky, only to infer it, to read the quality of the pale wash of light that came through the vent, and understand from it whether the day would be cold, or cold and gray, or cold and wet. It had been cold and wet for 6 days running. This morning it was merely cold. She had been here 43 days. She had kept count on the inside of the shed door with a fragment of charcoal, small marks in clusters of 5, not because she expected rescue, but because the counting was a form of order, and order was what she had, instead of hope. Dorothea Harcombe, born Dorothea Vale, baronet's daughter, 4 years a duchess, had been declared dead to the parish on the 22nd of September in the year 1817. She had not consented to this. She had not been consulted. She had been told by Lady Eugenia in the cold precision of a woman who has done an unpleasant thing and expects not to be questioned about it, that the arrangement was a necessity, that the estate's affairs required certainty. Dorothea's refusal to sign over her jointure rights had left Lady Eugenia no choice. The word necessity had been used 3 times in that conversation, the last time accompanied by a gesture toward the door that was not a gesture but a direction. She had spent one night in the smallest upstairs room, the door locked from outside. On the second day she had been moved, by means she did not entirely reconstruct until it was completed, to the garden shed. The old head gardener, Josiah Peel, had left a blanket over the threshold before the door was locked. He had done it, she understood later, at considerable personal risk. He had continued to do it, folding food into the blanket every other morning before dawn, a heel of bread and sometimes an apple, and once a small volume of Cowper's poetry, which he had found in the potting room and could not have known she would prize, but which she had read so many times in 6 weeks that she could recite the long lines from memory without the page. He had also given her the key, not the padlock key which Lady Eugenia held. A different key, a small brass one. The key to the inner bolt of the shed's only door, so that Dorothea could lock herself in at night from the inside and know that no one else could enter without her choosing to admit them. She kept it in the hem of her dress. She had sewn it in herself, with a length of the jute twine and a shard of broken potedge for a needle, and the sewing had taken her most of an afternoon, and she had been proud of it. The knock, when it came, was not Josiah's knock. She went very still. Josiah's knock was 3 light taps, and then a pause before the 4th. This knock was different in every particular, measured, direct, the knock of someone accustomed to being heard on the other side of whatever door he stood before. A man's voice. "Is someone in there?" She pressed her back against the east wall, her heart striking with a force she felt at the base of her throat. She had told herself, in the worst of the early weeks, that she would not speak to anyone sent by the house, that she would not trust a voice she did not know. She had made herself that promise on the 7th night, when she had heard Gerald Harcombe walking the path outside at dusk, his voice low and satisfied in a way that told her he believed the shed was empty. This voice was not Gerald's voice. It was lower, quieter, and came with no satisfaction in it whatsoever. "If there is someone inside this structure," the voice said, and she could hear in it a careful evenness that a person adopted not because they were unshaken, but because they had learned to be still when they were shaken, "I would ask them to speak, if they are able to speak. I am Nicholas Ashby. I was a friend of the late Duke." She felt the word Lateland in her chest the way cold water lands. She took one breath. "The late Duke's widow," she said, "is not dead." If you have found this story as strange as Dorothea found her own situation, stay with it a little longer. She heard no answer for a long moment. Then, with the unhurried movement of a man taking time to be certain he had heard correctly, his voice came again. "Your Grace, yes," she said. "The key is through the gap at the bottom of the door. The hasp is padlocked from the outside, and I cannot address that. But the bolt on the inside is mine. To give you. Take it." She pulled the brass key from the hem of her dress. She knelt in the cold on the earthen floor, knees through the threadbare cream muslin, and worked the key through the gap where the door met the stone sill. She felt his hand take it from her side. The light, when the door opened, struck her like something physical. 6 weeks of shed light, vent light, charcoal scratch light, and then the pewter November morning all at once. She put her hand up before she had decided to. He was standing back from the door, which she noticed. The care of that, the instinct to give her the space to step out rather than standing in her way. He was tall, and had the set of a man who had spent years outdoors in conditions that were not agreeable. The slight lean of the long compine, the kind of stillness that is not passivity, but the conservation of something. She stepped out of the shed. She had not stood on open ground in 43 days. The air tasted of dead leaves and chimney smoke and something mineral in the stone walls, and she stood in it and breathed it, without bothering to seem composed, because she was not composed, because she was a woman who had just stepped out of a locked shed where she had spent 6 weeks believing that the world had decided not to look for her. She felt the ground under her feet through the thin soles of her slippers, the actual solidity of it, the slight give of dead grass and frozen earth, and she understood in a way she had not permitted herself inside the shed, that she had not been entirely certain on some mornings whether she would stand on open ground again. She pressed her lips together and stood upright. He looked at her steadily. He looked at her dress, the thin cream muslin gone gray at the hem, and the cuffs, the borrowed gray Spencer jacket, 3 sizes too generous through the shoulders, the absence of gloves, the hair she had pinned herself without a mirror, and could feel was imperfectly managed. He looked, and he did not look away, and he did not shift the quality of his attention downward in the way of people who have decided that what they are seeing is less than what they had expected. His eyes were dark hazel and very level, the eyes of a man who had seen conditions that made a shed and a kitchen garden one item in a longer catalogue of things the world ought not to permit, and who was not distracted by the appearance of the woman before him from what she actually was. She found that more steadying than she had expected. "How long?" he said. 43 days, she said. "I kept count." He nodded once, slowly, as though the number were a fact to be absorbed rather than a horror to be performed at. She found she was grateful for that, too, the refusal to perform distress at her on behalf of himself. "Can you walk?" he said. "I can walk perfectly well," she said, with more sharpness than she had intended, and he almost smiled. It was a very small, almost a single degree of movement in the corner of his mouth, but she noticed it the way one notices warmth after cold, before one has decided to notice. "There is a gardener's cottage at the east end of the kitchen garden," he said. "I would like to put you somewhere warmer before we discuss anything else. Josiah Peel is the gardener," she said. "He knows I am here. He has been the only person who knew I was here." "Then let us go to Josiah Peel," he said, and he stepped aside and let her go first. She walked out of the kitchen garden with her head up, past the espaliered pear trees on the south wall and the empty beds of the herb garden, and the stone path she had walked 100 times when she was the Duchess of Harcombe, in fact as well as record. She did not walk quickly. She did not allow herself to hurry, because hurrying was what a frightened woman did, and she had decided, sometime in the 3rd week of the shed, that she would not be a frightened woman for the rest of her life, that she had already paid that particular cost in full. The cottage was low and warm, the fireplace doing its work with the authority of a hearth that had been well tended for 40 years. Josiah Peel opened the door before they knocked, his deep-set eyes going to Dorothea with the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight so long that he has stopped feeling its size, and whose face now showed mostly relief. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was rough in the way of men who do not speak their feeling, but whose bodies do not know how to hide it. "Josiah." She put her hand on his sleeve for a moment. Briefly, the way one notes a thing that matters too much to be discussed. Nicholas studied the old man while Josiah poured water over the fire's coals to make tea from the small remaining store, his hands steady, his movements those of a man who had developed his economy of gesture across decades of careful outdoor work. He was 68 at least, and had served the Harcombe estate since before the late Duke had been born. He confirmed every particular of what Dorothea had told Nicholas on the walk across the kitchen garden. The night of the 21st the door locked from outside, the morning of the 22nd when the parish register had been marked, the false accounting for the Duchess's jointure that Lady Eugenia's solicitor had drawn up in the confidence that no one would ask to see the original will. "The original will," Nicholas said. "Where is it?" Dorothea looked at him. She had been watching him since he opened the shed door, the way one watches a thing one does not yet know how to trust, observing carefully. She observed that he did not fill silence with words. She observed that when he asked a question, he attended to the answer rather than forming the next question while the answer was still arriving. She observed that he held his cup as though warmth were a practical matter, rather than a pleasure. She observed that he had not once, in the 40 minutes since opening the door, made her feel that she owed him gratitude she had not chosen to give. "In the floorboard," she said, "third from the door on the left." I put it there the night before they moved me to the shed. I went back for it once, 2 weeks in, when Josiah created a distraction at the south gate. It is still there." "You went back," he said. "I needed to be certain it was there," she said, "in case someone came who could use it." He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face that was not quite the expression she had learned to expect from men when they were recalculating what a woman was. But it was in the family of that expression. "We need the solicitor," he said. "Not Lady Eugenia's. The original man who drew up the Duke's will, Mr. Thomas Callow," she said. "His offices are in Trowbridge. He was the Duke's own man, not the family's. Can Callow be sent for without alerting the house?" Josiah from his corner of the room said that he knew a boy in the village who ran messages for a penny, and would not know whose errand he was running. "Then send for him," Nicholas said. He stood. He was still in his coat, still booted, the posture of a man who has not decided he will be comfortable yet. "I will go back to the house and keep Lady Eugenia occupied with condolences. There is a great deal of condolence still available to me." Despite everything, Dorothea felt the small, strange warmth of an almost laugh in her chest. He went. She sat at Josiah's fire and put her hands near the heat, and the feeling came back into her fingers. Slowly, painfully, the way feeling always returns after too long in the cold. They waited out that afternoon and into the evening before Callow's reply came. The boy returned at dusk with a note in the solicitor's hand confirming that he would come the following morning, and that he had the duplicate will in his Trowbridge strongbox, and that he had entertained certain private unease about the events of September that he had not known how to voice to a family in mourning. Nicholas came back to the cottage after dark. He ate bread and cold chicken with Josiah and Dorothea without ceremony. 3 people in a small, warm room conducting themselves around a situation that had no social form. It was in the quiet after the meal that he told her about Edmund. He had not meant to. He could not entirely account for what opened in him, in the firelight, with this woman sitting across the hearth who had spent 43 days counting the marks on a door, and who had gone back for the will in the night, because she needed to be certain someone could use it. He told her about the ridge at Salamanca, about the posted order that had placed him in the rear position, and placed Edmund on the forward ground, about the sequence of events that had no moral logic, that had simply happened the way battle happened, without fairness or design. He was 23, he said. "How long ago?" she said. 5 years, he said. "I've been on the continent since." Or near enough since. There was London in between, for stretches, but I could not stay. She did not say that he could not have known. She did not say that it was not his fault, which he did not believe, and which he had found people said not because it was true, but because they needed the conversation to move somewhere more comfortable. She said nothing at all for a long moment, and the silence was not the silence of someone searching for the right words. It was the silence of someone who was actually sitting in the room with what he had told her. "He sounds like someone you had not finished knowing," she said at last. He looked at her. Her gray-green eyes in the firelight were steady, and she did not look away, and she did not offer him any of the shapes of comfort that people offered in order to close a wound they could not hold. She simply looked with the full quality of her attention, and he understood that she was someone who could do that, who had enough internal country to sit with another person's grief without needing to manage it into a more manageable form. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." The fire shifted and settled between them. The cottage was very quiet. Josiah's breathing from the back of the room the only sound beside the fire, and the cold outside pressing against the small windows, and the distant sound of the estate that was not quite silence but the composite of a large house at rest. He was aware. In the way one becomes aware of things one has not permitted oneself to notice, that she was sitting across from him with her bare hands in her lap, and that her hands showed 6 weeks of cold in the condition of the knuckles and the slight rawness of the skin at the wrist. He was aware that he wanted to put his hand over hers, not as a gesture of anything that had a name yet, but in the way one responds to cold with warmth, practically without requiring it to signify. He did not. He kept his hands where they were, She reached into the pocket of the oversized Spencer jacket and brought out the small brass key, turned it between her fingers once, and held it out to him across the hearth. "Take this back," she said. "I should like you to go to the shed tomorrow morning and retrieve the will from the floorboard yourself. I would rather it came out by your hand than by mine alone, when the time comes to present it." He took it. The key was small in his palm and warm from her pocket, and he was aware of that warmth with a precision that was not appropriate to the occasion, but that he did not try to dismiss. "We should be ready for Callow by 10, he said. She nodded. Josiah had already put her name on the cot in the back room and taken the chair for himself with the arrangement of old men who have made their accommodations with discomfort. She stood to retire, and Nicholas stood also, because he had been raised in a world where one stood, and for a moment they stood on either side of the hearth fire, with the key between them which was not between them anymore, and neither of them spoke. If you have stayed this far, you already know this story is not finished. She went to the back room. He banked the fire and let himself out into the cold November night, the key in his breast pocket, the shed's direction fixed in his mind like a position on a map, in the morning while Nicholas went for the will. Josiah went to the dairy for milk and came back with his face set in the way of a man carrying news. He has had the walk home to prepare himself to deliver. Lady Eugenia had seen Nicholas arrive the previous evening. She had sent Gerald and a manservant to the cottage on the pretext of consulting Josiah about the south garden wall, and Gerald had found the evidence of 3 people dining rather than one old gardener at his supper. The cottage had been searched in the early hours before dawn. Josiah had been told that his services were no longer required at Harkham Park, and that he was to remove himself from the property by nightfall. The letter that Josiah had received from Mr. Callow, which had been placed on the cottage table, was gone. Dorothea stood with this information, and let it settle through her in the particular way of a blow that is not unexpected. She had prepared herself across 43 days in a locked shed, for the eventuality that the careful thing would fall through and the reckless thing would be required. She had simply believed, last night, sitting at the fire, that she was past the worst. She was still standing with her hands quiet at her sides when Nicholas came through the door. He had the will. He held it in his hand, a folded document with the Duke of Harkham's seal still intact, removed from the floorboard before anyone had thought to look for it there. "They have taken Callow's letter," she said. "I know," he said. "I passed Gerald at the south gate. He had the look of a man who has done something he considers clever. He set the document on the table. The letter named Trowbridge and Callow's offices, which Gerald will now visit before we do. He will not find what he is looking for. What he sent the letter for is already in my coat pocket." She looked at him for a long moment. "The duplicate," she said. "Callow sent a writer this morning with the duplicate before the original letter could be intercepted. I met the writer on the road." He said it without pride, in the tone of a man reporting the outcome of a piece of forward planning. "I wrote to Callow 3 days ago, the day I came to pay my respects. Something about the house did not read correctly, and I could not account for it." She thought of the unwept leaves on the lawn. "The duplicate is sufficient," he said. "Combined with the original from the floorboard and with Callow's own testimony, it is more than sufficient." He looked at her steadily. "Lady Eugenia is having a dinner this evening. I was invited, as a neighbor. Gerald is to announce an engagement to a Miss Fortescue of Bath." Dorothea understood what he was telling her. "There will be witnesses tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. "The local families. The Wrens are expected, and Sir Arthur Wren is the magistrate for this part of the county." She thought about the shed. The charcoal marks on the door, 43 of them, each one a morning she had decided not to give up. The cold that had settled into her knees, and the back of her neck, the quality of light through a vent she could not quite reach. "Tonight, then," she said. Lady Eugenia's dining room held 22 people by the time the soup was removed, and Gerald Harkham sat at his mother's right, with the comfortable expression of a young man who believed himself the evening's central event. He was 24 and had inherited the late Duke's height without the late Duke's gravity. a fact that had always been visible but was now in the candlelight of a room he intended to occupy as its master, strikingly apparent. Lady Eugenia was in her usual black, the diamond brooch at her collar, the fan held at the measured height. She had greeted Nicholas at the door with the particular warmth of a hostess who is not quite certain why she has given a certain invitation, and has decided not to examine the uncertainty. He had come in from the cold, looking exactly like what he was, a man who had been on the continent for 5 years and had seen things that left no room for social performance. He had accepted a glass of wine and held it without drinking. He had also, at the side door, admitted Dorothea. She stood now, in the anteroom off the dining room. In the best dress Josiah's late wife had left in the cottage trunk, a dark green wool that was 10 years out of fashion and fitted poorly across the shoulders, and was the finest thing available, and so she wore it without apology. She had pinned her hair herself, again, with the 3 pins that remained to her, and she had looked at the result in the piece of broken mirror Josiah had found in the potting room, and she had decided it would serve. She heard, through the door, Gerald rise to make the announcement. She heard him say with the warm complacency of a man distributing good news that his late aunt, the Duchess of Harkham, who as the assembled company was aware had been taken from them in September, would surely be gladdened, wherever she had gone, to know that the family carried forward, that the estate carried forward, that the Harkham name carried forward in the person of himself and his intended Miss Arabella Fortescue, who was herself a great comfort to the family in their grief. She heard Lady Eugenia's voice, dry and composed. "The poor woman is gone, and we do her memory the honor of continuing. That is all any family can do." She heard the polite sounds of the assembled company. Glasses lifted, approval murmured. Then she heard Nicholas's chair move. She opened the door and stepped into the candlelit room. The effect was not immediate. It arrived in stages, the way recognition always arrives in a room full of people. First, the nearest face turning, then the next, then the ripple of attention, as each person recalibrated what they were seeing. A woman in a green dress, in the doorway. A woman who was not a servant and not a guest, and who stood with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that the next 90 seconds will be the one she has spent 43 days preparing for. Gerald's expression moved through confusion to something unnameable. Lady Eugenia went very still. Nicholas had crossed the room in the time it had taken the recognition to arrive, and he was standing now between Dorothea and the dining table. Between her and whatever Gerald Harkham thought his next move was. He reached into his coat and produced 2 folded documents, and he placed them on the table in front of Sir Arthur Wren, who sat at the table's center with the face of a man who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening and was now adjusting rapidly. "The will of the late Duke of Harkham," Nicholas said, "sealed and witnessed in the autumn of 1815, and a certified duplicate in the hand of Mr. Thomas Callow of Trowbridge, the Duke's man of business." He turned to face the room. Not Gerald, not Lady Eugenia specifically, but the room itself, the 22 people at the table who were the witnesses that made this moment procedurally real. He said quietly so that the room had to attend, "She is the Duchess of Harkham, and she stands before you." Lady Eugenia's fan stopped moving. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply that the hand holding it forgot what it was doing. And the fan, held at its usual measured height, was still. Sir Arthur Wren stood and picked up the documents and began to read. Gerald Harkham said something that Dorothea did not entirely hear, because she was looking at the room, and the room was looking at her. 22 people in various states of recalibration, the social machinery running its adjustment at the speed such machinery always ran, which was slower than justice but faster than its opponents expected. She saw 2 of the older women at the table exchange a look that was not disbelief, but recognition. The recognition of people who had noticed the autumn of the estate and filed it without a frame. She did not look at Lady Eugenia until Lady Eugenia spoke. "There is clearly," Lady Eugenia said, her voice carrying its usual composure, but at a reduced register as though the instrument had lost 1 string and was compensating, "a great misunderstanding." Sir Arthur Wren looked up from the will. "Theory." "Lady Eugenia," he said in the tone of a man choosing his words because they will be reported afterward. "The parish record will need to be reviewed in the morning. I would appreciate your remaining in Wiltshire until that review is completed." Dorothea thought in the silence that followed of the charcoal marks on the shed door. She thought of Josiah at dawn, folding bread into a blanket. She thought of Cowper's poetry and the third floorboard from the door, and the cold that lived in the back of the neck after long weeks in a stone building. She did not speak. There was nothing she needed to say. She let the room hold what it was holding, let the candles burn where they were burning, and stood in the green dress with the 3 pins in her hair and let herself be seen. The parish register was corrected on the morning of the 13th of November, in the year 1817. The entry crossing out the death record was made in Mr. Callow's hand, witnessed by Sir Arthur Wren and the curate of the Harcombe Parish Church. And Mr. Callow had the considerable personal satisfaction of having brought both the original will and the duplicate with him to the register office, so that the Duchess of Harcombe's rights of jointure were confirmed in the same hour that her existence was. Lady Eugenia left for her own property in the north of England 3 days after the dinner, accompanied by Gerald, whose betrothal to Miss Fortescue of Bath did not survive the December of that year, though that was a separate story. She did not leave without saying anything. She came to Dorothea in the east drawing-room on the morning of her departure, and stood in the doorway with her hands folded and said, in the tone of a woman who has done an unpleasant accounting and intends to report its results accurately, that she had believed the estate required certainty, and that she had pursued certainty in a way she now understood to have been a great wrong. Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. "I know you believed it a necessity," she said. "I know you are someone whose script has worked everywhere else." Lady Eugenia blinked once, the blink of a woman receiving a truth she had not expected, in the form she had not expected. "Yes," she said. She did not say more. She turned and left the room, and the sound of her heels on the stone floor was steady and measured all the way to the carriage. Josiah Peel was reinstated to the position of head gardener at Harcombe Park by the end of that week. He received the news without ceremony, and the following morning was found in the kitchen garden with his hands in the earth before the frost had lifted, which was the way he had always begun his days and the way he intended to continue. Nicholas did not leave immediately. He had no pressing reason to, and the estate had immediate practical requirements in which his help, offered without being asked, was quietly accepted. He sat with Dorothea over the estate accounts 3 evenings in a row at the library table, the fire going steadily behind them, and they did not always discuss the accounts. "You wrote to Callow before you even heard the sound from the shed," she said, on the second evening. "The leaves," he said. She looked at him. "No one had raked them," he said. "Charles was particular about the grounds. Something was wrong before I dismounted." She thought about that. She thought about the quality of attention that noticed a wrong thing in a house full of performed grief, that filed it rather than dismissing it, that acted on it in advance of proof. She had spent 6 weeks believing that the world had decided not to look for her. And the world had looked. It had simply needed one person who was paying the right kind of attention. She did not say any of this. She returned to the accounts. He stayed 4 days beyond the accounting. Then he went back to Fenwick, his own estate, 17 miles north, for reasons she understood to be practical, and which she did not examine. She watched the carriage take the gravel drive from the east window of the library, and then turned back to the room which was her room, in her house, in her life, and felt the weight and the rightness of that. And the other thing, she was not going to name yet. He came back in January, when the snow was on the Wiltshire ground, and the kitchen garden was white, and sleeping under its winter covering. He came formally this time with a calling card, which made her almost smile in the entrance hall. She received him in the drawing-room she had chosen for her own use, the smaller west-facing one with the bookshelves along one wall and the fire she kept going all day, and Josiah's small cactus on the windowsill that he had moved there from the cottage in December because the light was better. Nicholas sat in the chair across from her, and looked at his hands for a moment, a gesture she had not seen from him before, the gesture of a man deciding how to begin. "I should tell you," he said, that I came in November because I was paying respects, and I stayed because of the accounts. I know, she said, and that I have come back in January, he said, for a different reason. She waited. Outside the window, snow was falling in the quiet, deliberate way of January snow, not hurrying, certain of its direction. I have spent 5 years, he said, at a considerable distance from anything I might lose. I had concluded that this was the appropriate arrangement. He looked up at her. I no longer find the conclusion supportable. She held very still. The fire went on with its work. The snow fell. On the windowsill, Josiah's small cactus sat in its clay pot in the winter light, unchanged and practical, and exactly what it was. Nicholas, she said, which was the first time she had used his name, and she felt him register it. Dorothea, he said. And there it was. Her name in his voice, quiet and direct, and exactly as certain as the snow. She reached across the table between them, and picked up the brass key which had been sitting there since November, which she had placed on that table the morning after the dinner at which the room had turned and seen her, and which she had left there as a record of something she did not yet have the words for. She held it out to him in her open hand. He took it. Not as a symbol, but as a thing. As a small brass key that had been given by a good man to a woman who needed to be able to choose what she opened. He folded it into his palm and kept it, and she was glad. The snow went on falling. Josiah Peel moved somewhere in the kitchen below, the measured sounds of the house doing its work, the only house it needed to be, the fire settled. The cactus did not stir. Outside, the grounds of Harcombe Park lay white and clean under the January sky, and the old locked shed at the end of the kitchen garden path stood open. Its door swung wide, admitting the cold and the light and the clean smell of winter earth, the way a thing stands when it has been found and has nothing more to conceal. If Dorothea's story moved you, leave a word below. Thank you for staying until the end.